Oops, all bards. Oh, what a mess.
Welcome to the Barbecue, where the cast and creators of Oops, All Bards grill each other. Ashley Banks was unable to join us tonight, but I'll let the rest of the party introduce themselves.
I'm Chris Klinecki. I play Poochton Ruckus, the aspiring best boy.
Hi, I'm Ann Coleman, and I play Clarice Sauercloud.
Hi, I'm Ross Curry. I play Andric Harrowhold.
I'm Bob Killian. I play Keylonian Stumps, the guitar-playing, peacemaking, turtle-like person.
And I'm going to let Nate go ahead and introduce himself, because last time Nate got involved in the conversation.
My name is Nate Runkle, and I'm the guy who produces this, who normally keeps quiet.
And I am Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. I'm the GM for Oops All Bards. Please don't ever call me by my full name. I will not know how to respond to that. I want to talk about episode 2 because we had a very interesting thing happen, which is that the plan had been to record episode 1 and episode 2 on the same day, which is actually what we did. And then by the time we got to the end of recording episode 2, I suspected that it might be going in this direction. But when I listened to it, I really, and Nate and I talked about it, we decided that we really needed to re-record episode 2. Part of that was that it was there were some technical issues. We were not all great about staying on our mics. And there were a couple of other things that had happened from a technical perspective. But I think that the other thing that happened was that I, your GM, did not do a very good job of running the encounter. I was just really ambitious. I had, I think, like 36 adversaries for you at some point. My intention had been to just overwhelm you and then make it mostly narrative, but everybody seemed ready to have an encounter. So when we decided that we were going to scrap that and re-record episode 2, I wanted to make it really different, partly because I wanted the campaign to run better, but also partly because I wanted to still be able to surprise all of you. So I'd love to know how it felt, knowing that normally in a home campaign, we don't rerun entire encounters. What was the experience like for all of you?
I think for me, frankly, I was relieved to get a chance to redo that combat because despite some of the work we did before the campaign on thinking about our characters and how they would react to something in the moment, speaking for myself, I found myself, as soon as combat kicked off, switching out of character and into player combat mode, trying to think of the quote-unquote correct thing to do rather than just reacting in the moment. So getting a second bite at that apple, I personally appreciated.
Yeah, I agree. I felt like it was good to do it. Many years ago, when I first heard that live play D&D podcasts were like a thing and people were doing that, I was really surprised because there are so many logistics in Dungeons and Dragons, that you're playing, especially around combat. And I remember thinking, boy, that can't work on a podcast. There's no way that could work. And obviously it has. But yeah, there are so many sort of logistics that are involved in doing a sort of combat scenario, and Dungeons and Dragons was like very much made for that. And
If I may chime in just real quick, and then I'll absolutely pass the baton back to you. But like, combat should be one of the most like exhilarating and exciting things that happens. And there's so many mechanics built in. There's so many opportunities to lose momentum that like it can turn from the most exciting thing in a session to the thing that drags the most pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciated the chance for a do-over, and specifically, I think it was not just a matter of the fact that this party hadn't played yet, but the number of potential antagonists. We do sort of without a map, without a visual game. So trying to keep track of where we were and what was going on was challenging. We also just had atrocious rolls for all of the NPCs. In the first version of episode 2. In the first version. And while obviously you want your game to be responsive to the dice and to have that unpredictability, there is a certain downside to having prepped a ton of different NPCs with different backstories and reactions, and then them all being frozen and unable to use them.
Yes. And, so in this episode that everybody has now listened to, there were 4 adversaries that came on and kind of cast a mass hold person over everybody who was on the dais. And in the original, there had been, I think it was 3 dozen people who were all responsible for casting that spell, because it was supposed to be more about shock and awe.
If I recall correctly, we were originally like the outside of the stadium was basically, or the field, whatever, was completely surrounded with antagonists.
The parameters of the dome were the same. It's just that there were, instead of just being 4 people kind of there to make sure everybody stayed in place, there were 3 or 4 rows of a dozen people who had all filed in to stand between you and that dome, basically to kind of act as a barrier in case anybody tried to get to the dome. And when there were that many people casting mass hold person, it became almost impossible to get out of hold person. So one of the decisions that I made when we re-recorded episode 2 was that they were only going to cast hold person long enough for Malvo's speech to happen, which didn't even happen in the first version of this encounter. So I decided to have that image of Malvo projected into the sky, and they're holding you in place just long enough for that. And the idea was that they were then going to release you and hope, all right, message is delivered, we're on our way out. And honestly, I kind of made them squishier so that if they died, it wasn't that big of a deal. There were 4 of them.
So I remember saying in the last talk back, which for me was about 15 minutes ago, but for you may have been longer, that seeing the game as like a big collective yes and sort of experience is, at least for me, like one of the most important things, and one of the things I enjoy the most about Dungeons and Dragons, and similar games like that aren't D&D, but borrow from it. But I also think as a player and or as a dungeon master, understanding just how far you're willing to go with the yes and is pretty important. For myself, and just very briefly, like in the campaigns that I run, I'm a big fan of games like Skyrim, of like Tears of the Kingdom, things that are really open world and really are like, if you want to do this, like, let's explore the consequences. Notably, my group in the initial game did not want to pick sides in a boss fight, so they persuaded both bosses to drop arms and rolled really, really high. And it took us 14 sessions to like really explore what happens when those two don't fight. That was a huge yes and that we took, and it spent like half the pandemic. We were just like working out what that meant, which was a lot of fun. But also, maybe you don't want to spend 14 sessions, allowing your players to persuade bosses to not fight. So I also think from a player perspective, for the first session, it felt very much like, depending on like who you are as a player, you might be like totally overwhelmed, like I don't know what to do, or you might take the Gimli, there's one dwarf yet in Moyo who still draws breath, right? And like if you're gonna go down, may as well go down swinging. And if you are looking for opportunities to play a character in a certain way, there are ways to structure the encounter from the dungeon master's perspective, where like, yeah, it feels like you can do anything, but like the best choices all are like ones that are hopefully guiding you in a certain direction that also complements what the dungeon master is trying to do. I know I've said this before, but like just for the sake of this. So like putting your players in situations where it may feel to them like it's totally open world and anything could happen, but it's pretty apparent to them, oh, like I could go in this direction and that would be catastrophic, or I could go in this direction, the one the DM really wants you to go in, and it'll be better, can make it feel like it's a free world and also give the dungeon master some extra sort of like, reins on it, but without it feeling like it's a track sort of like a rail shooter and nobody has really any choices or can't turn left or right. The second session did that better. There were fewer NPCs. There were more opportunities for us to be encouraged to use like bardic spells rather than melee combat things. And I think the second session turned out better as an Oops All Bards because of that.
And I think Bob was starting to say something about how D&D and combat feel very intertwined. I think for myself, and perhaps also for Ross, who hasn't played a bard either, they're the things we know how to do in D&D, and the first time we went through, we defaulted to those. But it's also a challenge because, as Chris is describing here, the breadcrumbs make a big difference, right? Understanding what things you should key into and reading the scene takes a certain degree of skill and confidence that as a first-time squishy bard coming into it, I was not keying into lots of cues. I didn't know what end was what. And so revisiting it invited all of us, but I can speak to my own personal experience more specifically. It invited me to think about why my character wouldn't feel immediately personally threatened, why she wouldn't feel she had to default to combat, because when there were so many NPCs, that was the only thing I could really think of.
May I posit another possible theory to that? And this was Jill being, I think, a fairly devious DM in some ways, which is that, and I'm mindful that we're all level 4 characters in terms of mechanically, we're advanced to level 4. I dare say, at least to my knowledge, none of us has ever killed before. And
Your characters.
To my knowledge, neither
Nobody
our
at
characters
this table has ever committed murder or manslaughter, to the best of our knowledge.
Is the producer excluded?
No! Hashtag free Nate.
I've got bodies. I don't. Allegedly.
But a lot of times when you're doing, at least in D&D, what's thought of as tier 1, which is levels 1 to 4, a lot of times your introductory encounters, in whether you're doing pre-written or even if you're building a homebrew from scratch, your first encounters are going to be clearing out giant rats from a cellar, going into a spider cave, fighting zombies, things where you don't really have to think about deep, consequential, emotional effects, not of the possibility of being killed, but the act of killing. Our enemies in this first encounter were very much described as humanoids, and had we gone into combat mode especially with just 4 of them, at least one of us probably would have had to reckon with committing a murder. And I thought that was really challenging thing that Jill put on us to think about, and that's another reason why I thought replaying that encounter was a net good, because at least speaking for Andric, in the intervening time, thinking about it, I was like, no, there's no way Andric would just kill in cold blood. He wouldn't do it.
Note to self: inquire whether stand your ground is a thing in Urva.
Yeah.
Get bark buttons to ask. Stand your ground, ?
So I know everybody here is a pretty experienced player. Anne and I actually started playing on the same day in the same campaign. And that was in, I think, 2017 or 2018. So it's been a while. Bob and Chris have been playing for a long time. Ross has been playing for a long time. I'm curious about everybody's relationship to combat in general as players, because in our last Talkback episode, we talked about this campaign that we were all in together that was really large because of the good nature and grace of our DM. And sometimes we would have a dozen people who were taking turns in combat, and one round of combat would take an hour. So it, in many ways, put me into a place where I liked RP a lot better than combat. And it wasn't until I started playing in other games, it's like, oh, combat can actually be fun too. So I'm curious, as players, where you all stand on combat and how you think of it relative to how you think about role playing.
I can start. I'm still not big on combat. I really like looking at what is before me as a puzzle to solve, trying to find the way to end combat as quickly as possible, whether that is trying to charm a monster or transforming my opponent into something else. In recent campaign finale moments, I transformed my opponent in one-on-one combat into a seahorse and then stored it in my water bottle so I would not have to fight it. I don't know how much of that is informed by the fact that I am in real life a pacifist, but in our first run through of this episode, I was the one who went to combat first, pulling out my rapier and slashing up an escaping baddie.
With an amazing entrance line that I'm so sad that nobody will ever hear, but maybe it'll come back at some point.
It might come back. I'm not going to ruin it now. But I think what I find most rewarding as a player is in the character development, in the changing relationships, in finding the breadcrumbs and kernels and navigating what that journey could be. So for me, combat is a way of developing and understanding my character better at times, understanding alliances and relationships, but it is never the thing that I'm seeking out.
I'll take a swing at this, and it'll be a wide swing. I think I might be the outlier among the four of us here. I said earlier that combat has the potential to be like the most exhilarating, the most exciting moments, and oftentimes, because of the mechanics, it can end up being like really dragged down. And I also said in the last talk back, what you get out of it depends on what you put into it, like, and understand like that's sort of an aspect of us coming together at the table is going to be a collective putting in and getting out of it, right? Combat in Dungeons and Dragons is one of the most mechanically dense and like laden things that you can do. Role-playing is, am I going to ask a question or answer a question, right? And I'd also say that combat, not just in D&D, but like in other games there's combat, like one of the draws is supposed to be the excitement of snap decisions. Something happens, what do you do? I remember in the first episode of Stranger Things, which is not really, Dungeons and Dragons, but that like encounter they're having with the Demogorgon in that opening scene, the dungeon master is leading this as a snap decision. Do you cast Fireball? Do you run away? And he doesn't have like 15 minutes to hum and ha through his notes about what his spells are. It's just, do you do it or you don't? In order to get it to that point, the dungeon master and the players all need to really do a lot of preparation beforehand to know what their arsenal is, what the enemies can do, and not, wait until it's their turn and then start looking through things. Now, Anne and Jill, you mentioned that when you started your first session of D&D, you came in at level 10, I think it was, level 9.
High? It was high. I don't remember if it was quite at 10.
It was when I joined that campaign. I came in at level 10.
So we
they
were
came
like
in at
6 or 7.
6 or 7.
Yeah.
Still like completely overwhelming amount of spellcasters. Like it's not just do you punch it or not. It's like you can cast 15 different things. You better be ready to do it, right? So like you were not set up for success there, I don't think, to make it really feel like you can make a snap decision. But I think it can get there if all the players and the DM want to take it in that direction. And like that's when combat can potentially shine.
Slightly tangential note. Okay. I just want to thinking about the that campaign. So Jill in that campaign played a cleric. And one night, and mild spoilers for The Legend of Vox Machina, there's a moment in The Legend of Vox Machina Season 1 when their cleric Pike Trickfoot reemerges after a long absence and just lays absolute waste to an approaching army of undead in this really beautiful way. And Jill's sitting on the sofa next to me and says, "Wait, can clerics do that?" Because I think your thought was that clerics were just pure heal bots, and I was like, no. Clerics can tank the heck out of a game.
And it's funny because my cleric, after that, we looked together at my stat sheet in that game, and I was, despite being a rock gnome, very tanky. And I had a ridiculous amount of hit points, and my AC was really high, and I don't even remember how that happened. I probably broke the build when I first made her. But to Chris's point about like doing that prep in advance and knowing your spells and knowing your actions, there were things we played in that campaign for 4 or 5 years, and there were things that were on that character sheet that in our very last session, our finale session, I looked at it, I was like, why did I never do that thing? So, especially if you're coming into a game as a higher level character, you're not starting from level 1 and acquiring these skills. It really is important to have an idea of what some of the things that you can do, your actions and reactions in combat. And I think I probably would have played that character differently if I'd known some of those things early on.
Or, to a point from the earlier talk back, like be ready to just, fail forward, communicate with your team, say, I'm a little overwhelmed, like I'm going to take a few minutes before it's my turn. If you have suggestions, like that's okay too. And understand that combat's going to take longer as we all collectively learn how to do things together.
Bob, what's your relationship to combat or combat versus RP?
As the pacifist of the group.
Right.
His character is a pacifist.
Yeah, I think actually, wanting to play a pacifist, it sort of occurred to me, the main sort of drive for Kelonian was that I wanted to play guitar. Like we were doing Oops All Bards, and I was like, I want to bring in the guitar, and I want to just like improvise a little bit. And I love playing Bob Dylan, so I was like, well, Kelonian's going to be like a Bob Dylan type. But it sort of, as we were working on the backstory for it, I was like, oh, what if like Kelonian was a pacifist? That I'd heard of other people playing pacifists in D&D, which because of how so many campaigns are combat heavy, Dungeons and Dragons has its roots in like combat, sort
Dungeons
of
and also dragons,
Yeah.
right?
Literally wargaming.
Wargaming, exactly. It's like that's why there are so many rules around combat, and like. But that is honestly something that makes it interesting, is that like I have to figure out in a combat scenario, what would Kelonian do? And, that informed how I built the character to have a lot of like helping spells or healing spells or things that would, not inflict damage, but would, help people or help to maybe like stop the situation or like bring down the conflict. So, it's interesting. It makes a drive. And I think that when you're playing D&D and you're doing combat, I think it really helps. The most fun combat encounters that I can think of are always things where it wasn't just fighting. There was other stuff going on. You were trying to protect somebody. You were trying to get into a door. You were trying to like do something. So if you're someone designing a game, like it helps to have other things going on in the combat situation, or like a motive that the characters have other than just, fight these other people. It does make it really fun when there's other motives or other things going on than just fighting,
So the other day, on 4th of July, Ross and I went to a neighborhood block party. And our friend, who was one of the hosts, had a couple of friends in town. One of them was this kid who was, I don't know, Ross, maybe like 12, 13 years old.
Thereabouts.
Yeah. And Ross was wearing a Critical Role t-shirt. And when we came in, he complimented Ross on his shirt. And it's like, oh, cool. Like this kid at least is familiar with the world of D&D. There were polyhedral dice on it. Like he got it. And later on, we were talking to him and his father, and we were talking about Oops All Bards. And the kid says to us, that's a very interesting choice, because you've created this campaign where nobody is optimized to fight. So how are you going to handle combat? And I thought back to our first failed attempt at this second episode and what we were talking about earlier, and this idea that everybody's character instincts kind of flew out the window and you went into combat mode. And I'd said to him, like, that's kind of the point. I wanted it to be, when combat happens, I wanted it to be a challenge. I don't want it to be straight up sword and board style combat. Like, we are an all bard party. We are heavy on charisma. We're heavy on negotiating abilities, and we've got magic, and we have all of these other ways to get out of scrapes. And so when I first started talking to all of you about the idea for Oops All Bards, which was almost 6 months ago, what were you thinking it would be like when we got into combat situations?
Can I loop back just a little bit to the earlier about kind of relationship with combat? What I really enjoy is when, everything, in my view, everything is role-playing. Combat's role-playing, exploration's role-playing, social is role-playing. So when combat can be used to facilitate a role-playing goal, or some role-playing comes out in the course of combat, I find to be very fun, whether it's NPCs or character relationships developing through something that occurs in combat. And one of the things I think that you did well this on the second time around was, the goal of each combat should not be to slay the thing in front of you, but sometimes the goal of combat is to survive and get out. Sometimes the goal of combat is to just hold off long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Those kind of alternative goals, rather than just kill the thing in front of you, I think are really productive. And I think that's, I think as all bards, I at least I don't plan on trying to negotiate or sweet talk my way out of combat, but what I hope we can do at some point is pursue alternative goals. This time we were able to grab a hostage out of this combat, and we were able to stand our ground long enough, grab a hostage, and that pushes the plot forward from a role-playing perspective. That's where I think this is going. We're not Oops All fighters where the job is to cut through everything that goes before us, but to advance the story through combat encounters.
I think that one of the things, at least for me, that happened between our first attempt at recording the second episode and our second attempt is that we had our finale in that game, that campaign that Anne and I first started playing in and that we were all a part of. And our DM presented us with the avatar of Tiamat and was very clear from the beginning. Michael told us that, you just need to get through, was it 5 rounds of combat?
It started at 10. He scaled it back to 5
because it was already
he did
9 p.m.
He did the math on how long it would have taken.
Yeah, again, it was a big party. But I think that gave us all a bit of perspective on there are ways to fight around something versus fighting directly against it.
Not to be contrary here, I've just pulled up
You're contrarian?
Well, I've just pulled up my character sheets to check this fact, because it doesn't feel to me like it is actually that different in terms of mechanics to play completely different builds. To me, it's about the character itself, right? In terms of needing to roll for things and needing to know your equipment and your spells if you're a caster and so on. There's a lot of overlap. What I find in terms of when I think about this question that you've asked, Jill, what were we expecting going in to being a bard? What I find as I look back is that I may have been a little overconfident. I kind of came into it thinking like it's just another caster, so I'll play him that, and what the redo and also having been able to visit this world a few times has helped me to see is that choosing to play them all the same way is in fact a choice. And there are different ways to even use my character sheet and stats that I perhaps hadn't optimized prior to this.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you wanted to.
I just wanted to throw out a fun fact, which is that in the original one that we redid, there was a point at which Keylonian, his action was to hug one of the enemies, yes. Which is, I was a little disappointed that didn't come back up again, but that's a fun thing.
It may come. I'm sure yeah. It's going to come up. Your grapple check is just going to be a hug.
Yeah, I guess and also I should say that for those listening at home, there were multiple extensive discussions that I think sort of underlie just a very brief reflection on my response here. But understanding that, as far as I understand it, Dungeons and Dragons, the game is balanced for a party of 4. That the challenge ratings and the experience you're supposed to get from enemies is balanced for that group of 4. And if you increase it to 5 or decrease it to 3 or whatever it might be, that means that the monsters you encounter are going to need either some scale thumbing or some adjustments on behind the screen side in order to make this still an appropriate challenge. And the party of 4 is usually 1 tank or 1 beefy character and 1 healer and then 2 damage dealers, right? And so if you can mix up that group if you want as players and as a dungeon master, but if you do, just understand the game as it is designed is not balanced for your particular group. So you're going to have to do extra work to make sure that the group that you have, as opposed to the one the game was designed for, has an appropriate challenge and has opportunities to be the characters they want to be, as opposed to the sword and board and the healer and the 2 damage dealers, right? So my expectations were that encounters were not going to be ones where you just send us against like, somebody who's, oh, there are 5 of you, so I'll put you against like, 1 challenge rating 4 and 2 challenge rating 1s, and that should be about balance. But like the encounters should be ones where the ways to successfully navigate them, this gets back to my earlier point, but the ways to successfully navigate them are going to be to rely on bardic spells and cohesion as opposed to traditional, like somebody needs to hang back and not die so they can heal, and somebody needs to go and like soak up things so that if they go down, it's okay because they have a bigger hit pool. I think that's one of the biggest challenges to running anybody's running a campaign that's a non-traditional one. Like just knowing like you're going to have to find a way to make this challenging but also fun and not feel like, you were tasked with something that was really for somebody else. Yeah.
I'm just going to push back a little bit. We've been living with 5e for 9 years now. The whole idea, the challenge rating of monsters or enemies at all corresponds to party size or makeup it's a myth. Challenge rating is useless.
Well, I think in this particular case, because we're existing in an entirely homebrewed universe and the campaign is entirely homebrewed, but I'm borrowing monsters and stats and mechanics from not just official canonical D&D material, but also a lot of supplemental material. If some of it's been officially released and is affiliated with Wizards of the Coast, and some of it is just kind of out there in the world, and you see stuff on Reddit forums. I definitely was thinking as I rebalanced this campaign for our second attempt, or this encounter rather, in this second attempt, I wasn't thinking about challenge rating so much as I was thinking about what is going to be. I don't want to kill all of you in our very first encounter out. We spent a lot of time building up your characters and getting art made for your characters and all of these other things. So what is something where there's going to be risk, and people can get, none of you did get hurt because you all rolled very well, but you can get hurt. But at the same time was going to be low enough risk that you were going to be able to scrape out of this. My initial thinking, I said, we had dozens of adversaries in the first time that we tried to make this. And my thinking was everybody was going to say, oh, we're outnumbered. We're just going to sit here and wait for whatever's going to happen. And that wasn't the case. That wasn't how things wound up turning out. And so knowing that, I kind of decided, well, let's build it in such a way that if fighting happens, then it's going to be weighted in your favor.
Getting back, because we talked a lot about above table, kind of more heady stuff, but getting back just into the game, into what the audience has just listened to, I'm curious about the one adversary's decision to use the sleep spell that actually ended up allowing us to take a hostage. Mm-hmm. And was it, and you don't have to spoil anything if I'm getting into spoilers for down the road here, but I found that to be a curious decision because it did not go well for the adversaries, and I couldn't figure out whether the adversary had misread us in terms of our strength, our abilities at that point. And this is an enemy that was well organized enough to cast Hold Person on some very powerful people on the stage. Somehow a dome has been created sealing in some also very powerful people, and yet they made this one decision in the heat of the moment that took out one of their own allies, which I'm still trying to piece together what that particular adversary's read on, and I think it was me and Belle who were right in the vicinity. Yeah. That didn't get affected at all, but their ally did. Yeah,
so two things happened there. One was that, yes, I kind of thought that this guy is going to misread you because you are, as far as he's concerned, you're kids. Like, you are all recent, you're not even officially college graduates. And so assuming that you're not as powerful as he was a fatal mistake because they were able to cast Hold Person so easily. Now, part of that is I I tweaked the mechanics of hold person so that it was amplified by the four of them casting it together, and it's, casting it at a higher level, all of those things. I didn't even roll for it. Like, hold person was part of the story there. Whereas the decision to cast sleep was a deliberate, like, he's going to underestimate you. Now, something else that happened there is that I misread the other baddie's character sheet. His armor class was 12. It's not that he had 12 hit points left. So we've all recorded episode 3 now, and we know what happens with that baddie who wound up being put to sleep and what the consequences of him only having 12 hit points at the time that he went to sleep was. But in the moment where I looked at the character sheet and I'm running combat and I've got so many different tabs open on my computer, I said, yeah, he's got 12 hit points, he's down. It wasn't until I listened back to the rough cut of episode 2 where I went, well, crap. I'm going to have to figure out how to make that work in episode 3.
It's a really interesting thing to bring up, the fact that we redid the that episode, because if you're new to Dungeons and Dragons, or even if you've played for a while, if you are if you were running the game, if you're a GM, DM, there are gonna be times where things don't happen the way that you think that they were going to happen.
And there are going to be times when you make mistakes, when you misread
right
a stat block, or it's going to happen.
Right, exactly. And Chris, to your point about yes and in D&D, that can be tricky, because on the one hand, you could be thinking to yourself, okay, there's going to be this one point where the bad person's going to put them all to sleep and they're going to wake up somewhere else. And then someone's like, I'm immune to sleep, like my character. And you're going to be like, wait, okay, never mind. But you're not immune to this sleep. You go, like, figuring
quick
out.
Shout out to Michael, too, executive producer, if you're listening. Like, this happened to him time and time again,
Yes.
because he had 11 characters and he couldn't keep track of them all, and like half of us would be like, no, sorry.
Exactly. And
I can't
it's
imagine.
like,
He was so patient.
Remarkable.
Remarkable. There's different ways to deal with that. Like, you can sort of, you're running the game, so you can come up with whatever you want. You could say, well, this is what's going to happen. Or, you can use that as an opportunity to be like, well, maybe everybody else falls asleep and this person pretends to be asleep. And what is that like, or whatever? I'm curious, Jill, for you, I imagine you've had to sort of rewrite or rethink some of the things that happen in here. And what has that experience been like for you?
In the very beginning of our first episode, I mentioned that I'm not officially a first-time DM because I've run several one-shots, but this is my first campaign. And I don't know why I was like, yes, I will put my very first campaign out into the world, and also I'm going to homebrew a lot of stuff. So it's a constant process of writing and rewriting. And even looking at my notes as we prepared to record episode 3 and having listened back to the recording of episode 2, there were certain choices that were made where it was like, all right, well, those 5 pages that I worked up, those are out the window now. And is it something that I can, and I'm keeping all of this stuff. I've got a scratch sheet where it's like, maybe I can bring this person back. Maybe I can make this encounter happen in a different place. One of the things that happened between episode 1 recording and episode 2, and this I think again was because we wound up having to re-record episode 2, is that Andric starts episode 2 in a slightly different place from where he finishes episode 1. And at the end of episode 1, Andric has this kind of very tense moment where he looks over toward where Belle and the other dancers are preparing, and he sees this person, Monahan, who's in Belle's dance troupe. And they have a moment. It's very clear that there is something between them. And I just completely forgot about it when I prepared to redo episode 2. So now one of the things that and we've recorded episode 3. So one of the things that I, as the DM, have to think about is, do we just drop this? Or do I figure out an excuse to bring Monahan back? Is Monahan under the dome? I don't know. So there's this kind of constant writing and rewriting and rejiggering process. I have 2 degrees in creative writing. I did my undergraduate degree in creative writing, and then because I wasn't enough of a disappointment to my parents, I got an MFA in creative writing. And when you're writing for something like that, it's very static, and it's very much meant to be, you, the writer, in control of the entire narrative. And yes, like when you're writing fiction, sometimes the characters speak to you and they might you might write something that's very surprising, but it's different when there are actual living, breathing player characters here who are affecting the narrative that you so carefully laid out.
If only there were a degree in recreative writing. That would be the degree for any dungeon master.
Yes.
So if it does come back, folks, you've just for the first time heard of Chekhov's Monahan.
Yeah, there you go.
But it's also true in D&D campaigns in general. You know, we have whether the benefit or the drawback of recording this, but in D&D campaigns, DMs or players will drop a lot of breadcrumbs, and it's not uncommon for anywhere between 50 and 80% of those breadcrumbs to never be picked up, to never come back, and that's fine.
It's like
Which
Lost.
is totally not okay if you're an English teacher or current English student in creative writing. That is what we call bad writing. Please edit out your extra breadcrumbs. It's okay to put in intentional red herrings, but come on, man.
But when we're doing an improvisational, collaborative storytelling experience, it's bound to happen, because you know what? The 20% to 40% of breadcrumbs that do get picked up in unexpected ways are going to be so much more memorable than why was that plot hole left open?
Why was there a polar bear?
Let's not start on Lost.
So,
I was just gonna say, like, Bob, we've talked about this, outside too. That, like, I think it's okay if, just speaking back in, like, the dungeon master perspective / like lowercase a advice, like, on the one hand, you may come to the table and be like, I think all these ideas are really, really interesting, and I can't wait to explore them like my players. And then your players are like, no, I'd rather run a tavern and have people come to us. And just because I've had to, just because your ideas are the ones that you think are important or interesting doesn't mean that your players don't have other ideas that are important and are worth embracing and pursuing too.
The thing that as DMs we always will joke about amongst ourselves is, I've set up these they get to a new town. There's a tavern where they're going to stay for the night, but they get a feel for the people in the town, and there's this dark elf in a hooded cloak. There's an orc and a large tiefling having an arm wrestling contest in the corner. Okay, well, who else is there? Down at the end of the bar is Boblin the Goblin. They will all want to talk to Boblin the Goblin.
yeah.
Yes. I've had a few moments where DMing a game where there was a random security guard. And, of course, everybody's like, what's the security guard's name? And I'm like, it's Bill. And they're like, I want to talk to Bill. And then, you give Bill a voice and you're like, oh, hey, everybody, it's me, Bill. And then
everybody loves him.
And everybody loves him. And then everybody wants Bill to come back. And you're like, you did not plan for that at all, but it happens. But you know what? It's great. And it's a gift. And that's why it's really fun, is that then Bill becomes a character in the game,
He becomes a DMPC.
Yeah, right.
Join you on adventures, yeah.
Right.
Okay. I think we're going to stop the conversation there. Thanks to the party for joining us. Thanks to all of you for listening. The next episode of Oops All Bards, episode 3, should be coming to your podcatchers in 2 weeks. And we look forward to seeing you or hearing from you then.
Oops All Bards is created, GM'd, and directed by Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. This episode was produced, edited, and sound designed by Nate Runkle. Oops All Bards stars Ashley Banks as Belle Cernamiel, Ann Coleman as Clarice Sauercloud, Ross Curry as Andric Harrowhold, Chris Klinecki as Poochton Ruckus, Bob Killian as Kilonian Stumps, featuring Paige Klinecki as the voice of the Bark Buttons. The Oops All Bards theme song is by Bob Killian, with additional lyrics by Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. Oops All Bards is executive produced by The Porch Room. We are part of the Porch Room Network on Spreaker Prime. For more information, visit oopsallbards.com. Thanks, and be sure to subscribe to Oops All Bards on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcatcher of choice. We'll see you next time.
How will it go?
Well, we're sure you can guess.
Oops, it's all Bards.